The translation I'm going to be reading is from Joel Relihan. His translation is actually available for free online. So I'm going to be reading from Relihan's introduction because it has a lot of very rich information. The golden ass and Lucios, Onos, which translates as Lucius or the ass, draws from a common source. They took from this source around the same time period, which was roughly 150 Common Era to perhaps 180 Common Era. They created vastly different texts from this common source. Relihan writes, sometime in the 1st century Common Era, there appeared a Greek text, now lost, called Metamorphoseos. Note the Greek spelling. An extended narrative about a young man turned into an ass who, after various degrading experiences and sexual exploits, ultimately regains his human form. These are what are called Milesian tales. A Milesian tale is a very bawdy, crude romp. It's kind of like penny dreadful literature, kind of like the thing you buy in like a drugstore in the 50s or something. They're not meant for high, sophisticated society. The story of transformations did not appear out of nowhere, as contemporary papyrus fragments and artistic representations suggest that a story of an ass that had sex with a woman is well known and frequently told in antiquity. The text was very popular. It's now lost, but we do know of it through a writer in the 9th century named Photius from Byzantium. He gives summaries of all the texts and he says, okay, so Apuleius is golden ass and the Greek Metamorphoseos basically agree, and Onos is crude and it cuts this stuff out. Metamorphoseos shares with Apuleius' golden ass an emphasis on other stories. It's a Milesian tale. It's not just a story of the ass who's the main narrator. It's a story of a lot of other things and transformations. Apuleius is a North African from Madaros. He was a great rhetorical master. He was quite well versed in many mystery cults, and he wrote the Golden Ass Latin romance in 11 books. It's the only extant Latin novel we have from the times. Yes, we do have some texts like Petronius' Satyricon, but Satyricon is only fragmentary and it's part of a much larger whole. So Golden Ass is very important in that sense. And my favorite anecdote about Apuleius is that he got this rich widow named Aemilia Pudentilla to marry him, and he was taken to court by her family members for witchcraft. Yeah, that's my favorite part about Apuleius, his apology. If you're reading Apuleius' version, there's a kind of supernatural deification aspect to it with book 11 that brings everything into perspective when he's finally changed back by Isis and devotes himself to Isis and then later to Osiris. The most famous excerpt from Golden Ass is book 4 and 5, which has the story of Cupid and Psyche. Apuleius is a very good middle Platonist. Cupid and Psyche is not in there for no reason. Apuleius is using this text to show the story of the transformation of a man into a literal beast and then back into a man and into a higher form of being. Apuleius really uses all these examples as a way to present the otherworldly soul's journey from the carnal to the higher Aphrodite, or the heavenly Aphrodite as it's known in Platonic thought. Apuleius likes to play around with narrative. He sometimes writes as a character, but then he writes very much as a narrator and blurs those lines of reality. He's kind of like Lucian in that sense. Apuleius takes the common Greek lost original and he adds things like the Egyptian or mystery cult lore, the story of Cupid and Psyche. He adds the ending with Isis and the initiations into the Osiris cults. But the link between the lost Greek original and its famous Latin descendant by Apuleius is the Greek text Lucius, or the Onos, also composed between 150 and 180 Common Era. It's clearly an abbreviation of some sort of metamorphoseos, as the metamorphosis is an expansion. Not surprisingly, the foci of scholarly and literary interest in Onos has traditionally been authorship. Like Relihan, I don't really care who wrote it. I'm more interested in how the author of Onos emphasizes what he does, leaves out what he does, and kind of reacts against the Greek original as Apuleius, in his expansion of that text, takes it and creates something very Middle Platonic and insane and beautiful. I don't think Lucian wrote Onos, but it's included in his body of work when it was transmitted, where Apuleius tends to emphasize the Middle Platonic conceptions and this very lofty philosophical idea. Ultimately, Onos is very much grounded in reality and it stays there. Relihan continues, I would say conservatively that what we have is the following unsatisfactory state of affairs. Onos is the anonymous Greek reworking, frequently but doubtfully attributed to Lucian, of the anonymous Greek Metamorphoses, blithely attributed to its protagonist, Lucius of Patras. One of the key differences, Onos does not contain any other stories besides Lucius's experiences as an ass. Second, we can show at certain points in Onos that the text has been consciously, sometimes clumsily, truncated in order to omit stories present in the original Metamorphoses. As the outline of Apuleius' Golden Ass is parallel to the outline of Onos, many of the same elements, and those elements almost all in the same order. There are two key differences that point to different desires on the part of the author of Onos. This is very important. And this is why I love Onos so much. Onos is very crude. Onos is kind of like Mark. If you read Mark compared to something like Matthew and Luke, Luke is obviously the best writer of those three. Matthew does a great job combining the Hebrew Bible elements with the bare bones of Mark's text. But just as Mark is my favorite because it's very to the point, it's very sharp. Mark's just like, here's what happened, this is what happened next. And Onos is the same way. Onos does not contain any stories related by other narrators. So keep this in mind. If you read The Golden Ass, it's not just the story of Lucius. Lucius as the ass is in it, and it's important, but there's also lots of other characters, lots of other stories being related. Onos does not take any other stories. It's just Lucius, his experience as an ass, and his mistreatment by his owners, and other little asides that he witnesses of slaves being mistreated, and the Roman army mistreating lessers. And I really think that there's a subversive reading that the author of Onos is doing here. We can show at certain points in Onos that the text has been consciously truncated. Whoever wrote Onos is emphasizing certain things on purpose, and he's choosing to ignore certain things on purpose. I'm just going to go over what the Metamorphoses is about and what Onos is in relation to the Metamorphoses or Golden Ass of Apuleius. Whether you're reading Onos or whether you're reading Apuleius' Golden Ass, it's the same narrator, pretty much, Lucius of Patras. It's basically a narrative in the first person, and this is all in Asia Minor. This guy goes to Thessaly, a place notorious in all Greek novels and in antiquity in general as the place where witchcraft has its home, and like the New Orleans of antiquity in a sense. How it's associated with voodoo and the supernatural and ghosts and things like that. He stays with this guy whose wife is really into witchcraft, and he hooks up with one of their slaves. Depending on which text you read, in Golden Ass, her name is Photis. In Onos, her name is Palestria. And Palestria means wrestling school, and there's a very explicit sex scene in which they go to wrestling school, and I'll just leave it at that. He's fascinated with witchcraft, and he wants to see one of these witches do their thing. And he knows that the guy he's staying with, his wife, is an expert in witchcraft, so he asks the maid, hey, next time she does her thing and she transforms, can you let me know? He's spying on this lady, and this lady is rubbing herself down with an ointment or the drugs or the pharmacos, right? He's watching this lady perform her spell, and she turns into a bird by using this ointment or her pharmacos, her drugs. He's like, hey, I want to do that too. So he goes to the slave and he's like, hey, can you find me that ointment? But she brings him the wrong one. And instead of getting turned into the bird, he gets turned into an ass. Relihan concludes that on the basis of the Greek text alone, Onos pairs away elements that do not have Lucius either as a man or as an ass front and center. Onos thereby rejects the narrative complexity that comes from interrelated stories. So like I said, Apuleius' Golden Ass and the Lost Greek Metamorphoses both had lots of stories that emphasize ultimately this deification aspect of humanity. And this is very important, and I want you to keep this in mind. Onos does not have a religious ending. And the whole final book of the Golden Ass, the Isis book, finds almost no parallel in the concluding pages of Onos. Onos basically ends with him running to the ship and then going home. And that's it. There's no transcendent Isis rescuing. The guy goes, he gets laughed out of the building by this lady because he's not as endowed as he was when he was an ass, and that's it. Onos rejects any notion of transcendence, any emotion towards the sublime. Relihan concludes that Onos is reacting against Metamorphoses being a Milesian tale, but nevertheless having this transcendental, serious effect to it. That's why he kind of excises all the transcendental religious aspects of the text and makes it just about Lucius's experiences on the ground. Because he doesn't think that this type of story befits such a transcendental text. What we have in Onos, Relihan continues once the dust settles, is a work comparable not only in length to Cupid Psyche, but also in inspiration. And that is perhaps where readers should direct their attentions most specifically when considering the interrelations of these three texts. Cupid Psyche, the dark pearl within Metamorphoses, for which there is no parallel in substance in Onos, or we presume the lost Greek original Metamorphoses, Cupid and Psyche is one story produced by the irritant that is Metamorphoses. So Cupid and Psyche is put in there by Apuleius to react against what he sees as lacking in the Greek original. Relihan concludes that these considerations lead me to take Onos as the work of an author who is protesting the use of Milesian tales and serious narratives. The Onos author strips all of those pretentious kind of stories that Apuleius would add of Cupid and Psyche or the Isis narrative at the end. And he says, no, this is what's happening on the ground. This is ridiculous, and it ends just as ridiculously as it begins. In some sense, the tale of loss of human shape and the regaining of human shape, the journey from animal to human, is a transposed story about the possibility of journey from human to divine. In Apuleius, this is obvious. Both Psyche and Lucius rise to the higher realms. What qualifies them for this, what makes them worthy of transformation, is something not to be found in Onos. Moral virtue, goodness displayed, trials overcome. But then he actually goes on to cite what was post-human transformation in ancient Mediterranean thought. And this is very important, and this is why I don't really care for a lot of transhuman, post-human stuff in the modern movement, because everything in antiquity that focuses on transformation from human to divine, this ascent is predicated on the sense that morality is involved and virtue is cultivated. When philosophers and prophets in the ancient world talk about ascent, about transcendence of human nature, elevation is always based on morale. Lucius's true self is merely earthly. In Onos, there is no sense of Lucius rising above anything. He's merely returned to his original state. He is a man who refuses to learn. Shape lost, shape regained, net displacement zero. His experiences as a Roman citizen crossing the paths of soldiers, thieves, and magistrates, and his observations of the steamy underbelly of life in the provinces, together they offer only this commentary on the Roman world. It is a sort of world in which the unregenerate Lucius belongs. There's no sense of rising above like in Apuleius' version of the story. At the end of Golden Mass, Lucius becomes an initiate and devotee of Isis and then later Osiris. So he goes and he proclaims this to the world, and that's basically his new calling. And in Onos, like I said, he gets turned back into a human. He's stark naked. He goes back to the woman. He gets rejected, and then he goes home buck naked. So he's at ground zero.